everybody, we've got one today. Intake manifold gasket. Now, this is going to be different for me than it will be for a lot of you because of the engine work that I have done, but the principle's all the same. The only main things that are going to be different for you are your PCV system and your VTS, VICS valves, vacuum lines, and stuff like that. But I don't think that it will be too much of a problem, and it will help a lot of people who have never removed their intake manifold before or who don't know the exact process for this. So I have already started, and all I've done is remove my AN lines. Most of you don't have this, and I've left the fuel rail in place. We can do that and everything else. Now, I'm not going to remove my strut tower bar. I don't think I'm going to have to, but if you are stock, you will have to, because your strut bar is going to come across here, and it's just two 17, I think they're 19 millimeter bolts that are on the mounting brackets on the side. So you can get that up out of the way, and then we can get started on this. And it should be a pretty easy task. It's not really that difficult once you see what to do. The fuel rail is the tedious part, and that is still very easy. So let's get some more tools out and take this thing apart. First things first is we gotta take loose the fuel rail and the cam sensor. So, not the cam sensor, the knock sensor. So, as always, be careful because we're working with a 12 to 15-year-old car and plastics get brittle, so we're gonna unhook that. And my fuel rail has two 12 millimeter bolts here. Most of you will have two here, and you'll have two in the back. So we're gonna remove these real quick. If Craftsman stuff would work, but it doesn't because it's garbage. And then after the fuel rail is unbolted, we can what a piece of crap. We can simply pull the rail off, and then we can get to the PCV system. Now, for most of you, the PCV system will be a lot easier to remove than mine. You can just simply pull it off, and it'll pull out of here and off the two ports right here on the intake manifold. Mine, I use catch cans, so I've actually got mine clamped on, so they'll be slightly more difficult for me to remove, but overall it's not going to be a big deal. So let me finish getting this pulled off. You don't have to disconnect your injectors from the wiring harness. Just set everything aside on a rag. You don't want to get anything in your injector tips or get anything dirty. Fuel rail is off. I just have it set out of the way. All my PCV system's off. So most of your cars are going to have two solenoids up here. You're going to have vacuum lines running around it. You're going to have your actuators for the butterflies on the side here. But you don't really have to take anything of that off to remove this manifold. And this can also work if you're replacing the rear motor mount, because you've got to remove this to get to its easiest way. Now, there's two support bolts back here. I believe they're 14 millimeter. And then there's all the 12 millimeter bolts that actually hold it to the head. So if you don't have cruise control, or if you just want to remove that, it's usually the easiest unless you crawl under the car. But the two 14 millimeter bolts can be got to from here or off to the side here. Don't break your dipstick. And those come off, and then here. And you are going to have to take off your intake piping, which I have not done yet. But I'm going to try not to completely remove the manifold to change this gasket. I need to take it off and take it back, but I don't want to actually pull it out of the car because it's a pain. You got to disconnect. You've either got to take off the throttle body or disconnect the throttle cable, and I don't feel like doing that. So I'm going to remove my EGR pipe down here as well. That's probably going to be the toughest part for most of you if you haven't had this off before, because it gets hot down there and it's very difficult to remove. But luckily, I've had mine off several times, so it's not too difficult for me to get mine off of there. So let's go ahead and EGR pipe, remove these two back bolts, and our intake piping. If you have cold air intake or if you just got a stock intake, it's fine. And then we'll come back to actually taking this loose. It's probably going to be the most easy for anybody with slightly large hands or wrists. It was difficult for me to reach behind here on top of the alternator to get to these two back support bolts. And like you can see, I don't have screws or anything like that under here. So I have a lot more wiggle room than most of you, so you might have to actually crawl under the car to get those two bolts. But they are both broke loose. Intake piping is back off, EGR pipe is loose. And we are going to go ahead and remove the bolts that actually hold the manifold on. Now some of them are a little hard to get to, especially on, again, most of the stock intake manifolds, because there's not as much room here to reach around like I have. But there's 1, 2, 3, 4 on top, and I believe there's 3 on bottom. There's one underneath the number 1 plenum, there's one in the middle, and then there's one underneath number 4. So there's 7 total bolts, and they're really not hard to get off. They're all 12 millimeters, so go ahead and break those all loose, and the intake manifold should be loose on there. Alright, it should be loose, and it is. So we're going to take it off as best we can, and hopefully it'll come off just enough where we can not mess everything up. Bless. Oh, I'm going to have a problem that you're not going to have. My catch cans are in the way. I'm going to have to remove my catch cans. Hell. Victory! All I had to do was move them out of the way. And it should come off. Pray. Let us have a pray. Oh no, that's going to be tight on there too. Oh. Victory! It is off. So, one thing that you want to check for, other than the obvious, don't mess everything up. You want to make sure that you don't hit any of your lines that are anywhere. And goodness gracious, that gasket. Don't want to have to remove this thing all the way to swap this gasket. Alright, so hopefully we can finish removing this. You want to make sure you can get it all off, all the old gasket off. If you can't, you're going to have to take the intake manifold all the way out, which means, for me anyway, removing the tower bar. You've got to take off the throttle body coolant lines, and you're going to have to disconnect the EGR sensor, the throttle positioning sensor. Thought there was another one. Idle air control valve too, I believe. So be sure that you get all the old gasket off before you go put the new one on, which I'm going to have to be very careful of doing like this. So let me finish getting this off and we'll get the new one set to go on. The back of the mounting flange was nice and clean, luckily. Unfortunately, if this is the first change for you, it probably will not be, and I pity you. So I've got it set back on. Now, one of the things that, not to sound too old, but that my dad always told me is start every bolt first. And this is especially true in this case because we have to torque it to the head for sure. But these two bottom support bolts are going to be an SOB to get on there if you don't start them first, which is what I'm going to do. I'm going to start them two first and then start all 7 that go into the head and put everything down finger tight. And then we will torque to the head first and then we'll tighten the support bolts down there. But overall, the job itself is not difficult to do. It's just a bit of a inconvenience, I guess. But anybody with basic hand tools can do this. So I'm going to start all these bolts and we will cut back from there. I started putting everything back together, so I make sure everything fits right. I don't have anything in a bind. These bolts are torqued down to 16 foot-pounds. here. Okay. There's actually a sequence to it, or so the factory says, and no way am I so arrogant to think that I know better than factory, despite the crap that I've done to this poor car. So 16 foot-pounds, and you start in the center bottom. So the center bottom bolt is number 1, and then you go to the top 2, 3, and then the bottom 4, the opposite bottom 5, top 6, top 7. So we're going to start down here and start torquing all these down to 16 foot-pounds. Everything's been torqued down onto the head, and I've tightened the two 14mm at the bottom. I readjusted my catch cans. So the next things that need to be done, EGR pipe needs to be put back on the correct way. Intake, tubing, and everything can go back on. Basically, we're just reinstalling in reverse order, making sure you don't forget anything. Make sure you check your vacuum lines, depending on how many you've had to remove. I've only had to remove the one for my pressure regulator, but that'll go on here in a minute. So basically all we have left to really do to button this dude back up is put the fuel rail back on, get it bolted back down, reconnect our knock sensor wire, vacuum hoses, AN lines, PCB system, whichever one you have, and should be just about good to go. So let's go ahead and get this thing put back together. There we go. Everything's put back together. Took me longer to get the AN lines put on than to do anything else. So, like I said earlier, when you do stuff like this and you're messing with not only how the engine performs, but how it maintains itself and everything as far as your vacuum system and your oiling system, all that, you need to be really careful and double check, triple check everything. Make sure there's nothing in a bind, there's nothing that's going to chafe through, rub through wires or anything. For instance, my wiring harness over here for the injectors, when I had the rail off, it fell back behind where the fuel line goes onto the rail back here, and it would have rubbed through the wires. So you want to make sure and go back over everything that you touch behind everything, make sure your intake piping isn't rubbing on the master cylinder. You want to reach back, make sure all your throttle and everything is loose, nothing's binding, you don't have a vacuum line binding, you didn't leave a vacuum line off. Everything's back on nice and good. Check your sensors, everything's hooked up, and that's all there is to it. For the sake of a $9 gasket, it's just all labor and then removing what you need to remove to get to it. Nothing on this is difficult or hard in any way. Just remember how it all came off and put it back on. Thanks for watching the video, everybody. Please like, comment, and subscribe right here for more Rage Fuel content. We'll see you next time.